I learned another new word this week. Dramatical. As in, you're being overly dramatical about this. Life in the South. You gotta love it.
You don't have to be poor anymore. Jesus is here.
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude. Not far from the redneck Mecca, this is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is in my lap demanding attention. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cat. And America. Get over it. This was supposed to be a news episode, but America and I gabbed about everything else besides the news stories, so what you're going to get is a bit of rambling discussion from us with one news story thrown in. I don't know why, but America and I will just get to talking and forget about doing the podcast. We've never done it quite so bad before, but we spent over 2 hours just gabbing and then looked at the clock and realized we had to stop because America had someplace she needed to be. That doesn't mean we talked about things like the weather. Our discussion ranged over race, gender identity issues, sex, and what seems to me to have been the murder of a local man by the police, to name some of it. Not exactly what I was planning when I was thinking about changing aspects of the show, but hopefully you'll still find it interesting. Before we get to America and I gabbing, in case you haven't heard, the fascist Marine Le Pen lost the election in France, so their new president will be the centrist Marsan. Hopefully this means the tide of wackos getting elected to high office is turning. And I apologize for the background noise. You can probably hear my neighbors are having a party to celebrate the new deck they just finished. I also need to thank George for doubling his Patreon support. Really appreciate that. It does help a lot. And I also need to thank Daniel from the Country Fried Free Thought podcast for becoming a Patreon supporter. That helps. Like you guys would not believe. So, with all that being said, let's get to America and I just yakking. One of the things that I'm dealing with in showing up the Democratic events here in town that I'm slowly working my way towards nudging them on is they have their, they have an annual statewide fundraising dinner. It's the Jefferson Jackson dinner.
Oh.
Yeah, Andrew Jackson. And it's like, folks, we really just kind of need to not have it be known as Jackson dinner. If we want to be an inclusive party, let's not have a racist, genocidal maniac name attached to a fundraising dinner.
No.
I mean, he's a big deal because he's the only president who, had a big house, et cetera, in Tennessee. Never mind that Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president and then became president after Lincoln was assassinated, is from Tennessee. Nobody talks about him. It's all Andrew Jackson here for some odd reason. And Andrew Jackson wasn't even born in Tennessee. But because he built his plantation here, we all gotta fucking worship his ass.
So how many people show up to these fundraisers?
Lots. And I mean, they're showing up because they're Democrats, not because of, it's named after Andrew Jackson.
Right.
But, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth, and I'm fucking white. I can't imagine what kind of taste it leaves in the mouth of somebody who has Native American ancestry, or is African American, is a woman, any number of things. Because Andrew Jackson was a sociopath.
I just wouldn't go. I think they have to know they're losing members.
You would think. And, it's $125 to be at that event.
What? See, never mind. I wouldn't even go.
See, when you were employed, you could probably afford that.
Right.
I can't. So, I don't feel included in all that. Now, there are ways I could probably finagle myself into being there, but that's beside the point. I shouldn't have to do shit like that.
Right.
How can I don't feel represented when, it's $125 or $100, depending on various factors, to be there. I realize the Democrats need money, but at the same time, they need to be including people like me who don't have money, because we're supposed to be their base.
Oh, no, you're not. Why would you even think that?
I don't know. One of those crazy things, I guess.
Yeah, you're crazy. Don't think that.
All of us have differing levels of trauma, but we can be impacted in the same ways by it.
Right.
I mean, I was a nerdy kid. I got picked on a lot, so I have empathy with people who are minorities, whether it be because of their color of their skin, their religion, their sexual orientation, their sexual preference, whatever. But my experience isn't going to be the same as theirs.
Right.
And at the same time, I feel bad saying, well, yes, I had a rough childhood because, despite the fact that I was a white male who was middle class for part of his childhood, and had privileges, etc., I still had to deal with these various outcomes, so I can empathize with somebody who's trans or who's black or who's gay or whatever. Even though I really shouldn't, because, trauma is trauma. And there are things which, would probably have me in a corner, in the fetal position, gnawing on my wrists, and you'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's Tuesday. Whereas, the reverse is also true. There's things that could happen to you that would upset you, but wouldn't bother me.
So I think experiencing trauma as a child, and experiencing trauma because of race would be different. So I'm very obviously black, but had my parents not been Mormon, we wouldn't have had an issue. I would have been a upper middle class girl in the suburbs had my parents not been Mormon. That's the only issue in that situation. The only one. They never hit me. And it even in discussions of race, it happened 10 times, maybe in the 12 years they were my parents. So it's powerful because it also was the reason my mother gave me away. But it could also have just been, the trauma of growing up in a religious environment, and part of that religion, tells me I'm wrong. I have a black friend who grew up Jehovah's Witness. And I didn't know this because everyone that I knew that was Jehovah's Witness is Hispanic or black. She grew up in St. Louis in Jehovah's Witness, and she was the only non-white person in her community. So she experienced very similar things to what I experienced as the child of a black or like white Mormons. But I think, childhood abuses cross racial lines, right? So knowing that children, unfortunately, are probably getting their ass kicked. In fact, I was in fucking Target today, and all the stalls were filled because women were in there yelling at their fucking kids. And I think that transcends, that's not about race. And so I don't think it would perhaps be best to equate the two, because I never received beatings until I moved in with my biological family, and she was a drug addict who didn't like me not being obedient. I'd never been hit until then, and it was more her drugs than anything else, because when she was sober, she would never consider raising a hand to you. But if she was coming up, coming down, or it had been a while and she needed a fucking fix, then it was a whole different issue. So I just don't. Childhood trauma and trauma that gay children would experience because they're gay, not just because they're kids, I think are very different.
Right. But the effects can be similar.
Yes, definitely. Trauma's. I think trauma's trauma. Well, no, I don't want to say trauma's trauma. The effects can be very similar, but I wouldn't. I don't know. I think you're toting a fine line. You can definitely empathize with someone getting their ass kicked, but the reason you might have gotten your ass kicked and the reason they got their ass kicked would be different. Right. So the ass kicking gives you common ground. Right.
And a friend of mine who she's trans. And for years, she lived her life strictly on the web as a lesbian. Okay, her public meat space life, she was a man. But for as long as I have known her on the internet, she was a woman who was a lesbian, and it's only been fairly recently that she said, actually, I'm trans, and she's one of these trans people who is intersect. Mm-hmm. So she it's not merely that her brain is wired up wrong for her gender. She had both sets of genitalia. And she, she did not grasp what it was like to be black and going into a store. She's like, well, I'm gay. Since her public persona was that she was a lesbian, as far as the internet went, she'd be like, well, I'm gay and I'm subject to discrimination and I don't feel the way that black people do. And it's like, But you can walk into a store and people won't automatically assume you're a lesbian, whereas if you walk into a store and you're black, people notice this shit and they have a different reaction to you. One of the guys I used to work with who was black, he talked about how when he was in high school, he and all his white friends would go to the store together because since he was black, all the store people would be paying attention to him, and he'd do, he'd go and look and get whatever while all his white friends were shoplifting because nobody was paying attention to them since they're white, so they're not there to steal, whereas the black guy was there to steal.
Yeah.
And so there are definitely differences, and one of the things that I'm starting to realize is that the people who have objections to certain aspects of it aren't in the affected minority. They're the people who are in the majority who don't want to admit that they're being racist. Because, I mean, if I were to say something that was racist, you wouldn't just automatically unfriend me and call me a horrible person. You would try to have a discussion with me to say, hey, did you know that this was racist or sexist or whatever?
Right.
And you would, in certain situations, you would say, this is what he said, but he phrased it awkwardly. He meant something else entirely.
Right.
I mean, obviously, if I were to, fucking start waving a Confederate flag and wearing Klan robes, you'd have a different reaction. But I'm not going to do things like that.
Right.
And I mean, you and other people who are in affected minorities, whether they be trans or gay or whatever, know that somebody like me is trying to be a decent human being, to show respect, even if I can't quite grasp all the nuances affected, that affect you.
It's like, so it's Cog Dis, right? It's Tom and Cecil. It's this most recent episode, or one of the most recent episodes, where Tom keeps talking about Ari Stillman and can't get the pronouns correct.
Right.
And
it was Cecil who did that. Yes, it was. Because I was there when Cecil and Ari ran into each other at ReasonCon, and Cecil was profusely apologetic, and Ari was like, no, I understand. It's not easy.
Well, there's also I think that's why. So on the most recent episode, they probably had just finished having that conversation. Mm-hmm. So Tom makes a comment, I really like Ari. He, she, they are really great. And Cecil just yells at him, just say Ari. Just say Ari. If you can't get it right, just say Ari. And so that's one of those situations in which, and again, I am not Ari, but I feel like it is possible for Ari to look at the situation and say, I recognize that they mean no harm. I recognize that they are trying, and I recognize that they are going to fuck up, and I recognize that this is my friend. And perhaps it's just a little bit of like gentle coaxing. But this is not an irredeemable human being that just wants to say fucked up things.
Right. Because I guarantee you, Tom and Cecil and 99% of the people who meet Ari would, be more than happy to take a bullet for Ari. If they could save Ari's life, because Ari is a very good person. And Ari recognizes that Tom and Cecil are that kind of people, that they would step in front of Ari to help them out.
Right.
And, I hate I hate the awkwardness that all this shit, because we're sorting everything out, you know. It's not, 100 years ago, everybody quote unquote knew their place. And now we're trying to figure out, well, how do we recognize individuals? How do we treat people equal? And it's going to take us a lot of time to work all of that out, because, the societal norms that we've had up until now didn't just appear in the 1950s or whenever. They had been established for centuries or millennia, and it takes generations for all that to work out.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know, I will fuck up in our friendship, and I will say something or do something that you find offensive, but I'm also certain you will understand that I'm not doing it deliberately.
No, I totally understand, and I say this all the time, and I'm not sure anyone believes me, but I mean it. I genuinely have issues with sexism. I feel like we should just change our entire show to us just discussing topics. So, it drives me kind of crazy when people say women can't be sexist and black people can't be racist, because I genuinely have issues with sexism. For all of my submissive tendencies, I say and feel and treat men rather despicably, which is not okay.
Well, it depends on.
Well, if they consent to it, right? Like if there's consent. But a lot of times it's not. And so I make a joke, and it's not a joke, it's a true story, about making a man cry during sex. It was a young guy. He was really kind of impressionable. It was, if not his first time, he probably wasn't up to his fifth time yet. And he cried at the end of sex. It was not very good, and it's not his fault. He was new, and I was angry, and I was frustrated, and I said horrible, evil, mean things, and he got really upset about it and left. And I remember feeling kind of good. There was a power that I had then been given by hurting this person, and specifically this young man, because he was trash in bed. And a lot of it was this misguided, I don't know how to explain it, but it was this, he won't go to other partners with the ego of, oh, I'm a sex god.
Right.
And I've saved some poor girl from, like, this trash guy in the sack. And I recognize he was not trying to not understand what was going on. He just genuinely didn't have the sexual experience to get why we weren't coming together. And I was an asshole to him. And I was an asshole to him because he was a man. And so I assumed he would act and think and behave in a specific way. And so I treated him in a way that was unacceptable. And so I am very serious when I say I have issues with sexism, and I'm very much working on them. And so I understand we will probably step on toes. And we'll just kiss and make up. It'll be fine, Tucker.
No. I can, when I was young, hung, dumb, and full of cum, I had a girlfriend who was a couple of years older than me and had a lot more experience with, having sex than I did. And, even today, I am not in her ballpark as to the number of sexual partners. And I had asked her after we had sex, well, am I doing okay? And rather than giving me an answer like, no, actually you weren't, she gave me, well, because of your size, you don't have to be good.
Right.
And it's like, that's not what I wanted. I actually, if I was bad in the sack, I wanted to know this.
Right.
So I could actually improve. And, I mean, she was...
Right, because unfortunately, if you perhaps were not a good person, there are men who are very well endowed that have probably been told or think that because they are so well endowed, they don't have to be good. And it makes me want to punch them in the dick, but that's also not okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, prior to this, like, my sexual partners had been, well, some random gal I'd met at a party, a gal who had apparently only had sex with a guy who was rather small. I mean, so small it was like, you sure you didn't lose part of it in an accident or something? A gal who was, married, so our relationship was more about, us, her doing me to get back at her husband rather than any kind of actual physical gratification.
Right.
And so this gal, that gal was the only one who understood that women have sex because they like having orgasms.
Right.
And so it was hard for me to, figure out what the hell I needed to do. And getting an answer, well, because, how big you are, and, I mean, I'm not really well endowed. You don't have to be good. That's not the answer I wanted or needed. And this woman complained, because I'm sort of the kind of guy who, when you're surrounded by a bunch of women, they don't see me as a male, so they talk about the kind of things they wouldn't normally talk about in front of men that they would want to have sex with.
Oh, I'm that way for guys. I think they forget I have a fucking vagina.
And she was, this gal would, it's like, well, the worst thing in the world is a man who's raised by a woman because they don't understand how they're supposed to act and et cetera, et cetera. Well, my parents divorced when I was 8. I lived with my mother until I was 18. So I was basically raised by a woman. And, she talked about, well, you have to train men, you have to do this, and then I turned him loose. It was just, there were a lot of reasons why that relationship was unhealthy, and I don't know where I'm going with this, but...
That's fine. We're rambling.
Yeah.
We're making a whole episode without ever having to do any of the hard bits.
Yeah. Well, there are definitely a couple of stories I want to get to. One of the ones that I put in there, and I don't see it off the top of my head. I know I put it in there. God fucking damn it. Did I not? I could swear. Yeah, it's buried. I didn't put the headline in there. but there was a incident here in town where a man in police custody who was in the back of a patrol car somehow found a gun and shot himself in the head.
Oh.
And let me see if I can find a better story on it than the one I linked to. Probably can't, but I mean, this town averages a murder once every 10 years or so, and in pulling up a different story, dude was black. Now, I'm just gonna say it. Wait, nope. The other story I can't. Sorry, Google lied to me. There was I can't find a photo of the gentleman, but I'm gonna guess he was black, and I'm gonna say it was fucking murder.
I find it very interesting that a gun just happened to be in a patrol car.
I mean, I've been harassed by cops before, and even in situations where, like years ago, okay, I had a car broke down on me in the middle of nowhere, and a cop was kind enough to stop and, give me a ride home. Because I was, out in the middle of fucking nowhere. That cop patted me down and checked for things.
Mm-hmm.
And this wasn't an arrest. This was, you're broken down on the side of the road. It's 2:00 in the goddamn morning. You're not going to be able to get home unless somebody gives you a ride. I'm a cop. I'm stopped to see what's going on. I'll give you a ride home. But he patted me down and ignored the fact that at the time I had what's known as a Cubiton on my keychain.
What is that?
It's an iron. It's a hunk of metal. It's a short metal stick, say 6 inches long, and if you're into martial arts,
Is it the one that kind of fits in the fingers?
No. That would be brass knuckles. This is it. It's just it. Think of something. You remember the pencils you had, like when you're in first grade, that are like hugely oversized.
Right, and there are grooves in it so you can wrap your hands around it.
Right.
And there's a spike on the end?
Right, that's more or less what this was. And he didn't even give a shit about that. I mean, you carry it for, self-defense. It's a good way to, add a little impact to your punch or whatever.
Right.
Without crossing legality lines, because in most places, brass knuckles are completely illegal. But he ignored that. I can't imagine that cops who arrested somebody, regardless of their race, would fail to pat somebody down and not find a gun on them. I mean, because, unless you're carrying a tiny 22 Derringer, a gun is a fairly noticeable object.
Right.
And, with something like a 22, you gotta hit somebody in just the right spot to kill them. Yeah, I know of an incident where a guy he had a 22 and it was a multi-shot gun. He was in a bar and shot some dude 5 times in the head, and that guy survived with minimal injuries because what happened was the bullets hit his skull. And rather than penetrating the skull, they just went around it, under the skin. So,
oh, that's okay.
So, I mean, you in certain circumstances, yes, you can kill somebody with a 22 bullet, but it's got to have the right power behind it. It's got to hit the right spot. And this dude shot himself in the head with a gun. That probably wasn't a 22. It was a larger caliber weapon. Had to have been. And the police somehow didn't notice this when they were patting him down. And, they're gonna, regardless of who you are, if you're a violent criminal, they're gonna pat you down pretty good.
Yeah, I find it unlikely that he had the gun on him, or that one just... I mean, how do you not know where your service pistol is at all times as an officer?
One of the things that I learned as a convenience store clerk and talking with the cops is, and it infuriates me when I watch, movies and TV shows, no cop only carries their service weapon. They all have at least one backup piece because they recognize there is a situation where, they might lose their service weapon and still need to, defend themselves.
Right.
So... I can definitely see having a cop carrying a cold gun, i.e. one which, isn't going to be traced back to any particular individual.
That's super shady.
Yeah. And, I mean, Google lied to me and because they showed a mugshot and I thought it was the dude, and then when I clicked on the article, I saw that it wasn't it wasn't him. It doesn't mean that he wasn't black, but this is a really low crime area. I mean, granted, okay, our crime has increased 2%, but it's still lower than what it was 10 years ago, and 10 years ago or so, we were averaging one murderer every decade. And having been in court and seen, black guys go to jail for things that were less severe than what white guys committed, and those white guys didn't go to jail, I'm kind of inclined to believe that, this was a fucking murder.
That makes me so sad. And this is something that won't hit mainstream media because it's no offense, backwater in fucking Tennessee.
No. I don't take offense at that at all. I mean, this is a backwater, and I mean, the state, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation is looking into the matter, but that doesn't mean anything will come of it.
Right, they could easily say, oh, yeah, we found nothing.
Right, exactly. Or, well, we can't find enough evidence to convict. The issue really is if the cameras in the patrol car were running at the time. They should.
That would be best.
They should be, and so far as I know, having spent a little time in the back of patrol cars, I believe all of the ones in town are equipped with cameras that record, both, the view that the driver sees as well as what's going on in the car. So, if that's the case, there should be video of the event, and it should be possible to see that. And I know we have body cams on the police officers here because a guy walked into to the hospital here in town, pointed a gun at a doctor there in the ER and said, give me some kind of drugs. And the police were called. They managed to de-escalate the confrontation and didn't shoot the guy. I think he was white. I'm not entirely certain of that, but I think he was white. So, that might explain why they didn't kill him. And I hate saying that, the assumption is, well, he's white, so he wouldn't get shot, but that does seem to be how things work in the world.
Over and over again, we see it happen.
Yeah. But no, I mean, that literally happened the other day. Which is, again, that's astoundingly rare for this town. We had, 2 weeks ago or so, I'm going to work and I see not every, but a huge number of police cars heading in one direction with their lights on. Now, I normally see a cop or two every morning, but generally they don't have their lights on, and if they do, they're pulling somebody over. So I knew something was up. And in this case, it turned out there was a woman who had barricaded herself in her house because she was mentally ill. And, the police arrived. They managed to de-escalate the situation without killing anybody, which they deserve praise for. I will bring up the fact that she was a black woman, so, the likelihood of them shooting her was probably higher than if she'd been a white woman. And I hate saying that. I really hate differentiating the issue of race in these circumstances, but I recognize that this is what happens. And, and this woman who, the circumstances, from what I can read in the news article, she clearly had mental health issues, but because our fucked up insurance system in the country, she couldn't get the kind of help she needed, which could have prevented this thing.
And a lot of people don't see mental health as a thing. It's the pull yourself up by your bootstraps. My grandmother was probably late 80s, early 90s when she finally went to a therapist and started taking medicine for her depression. And I remember her saying that it was amazing to know that there was a word for the feeling. And it like, her whole life, it had been God and Jesus and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But I can't imagine what it's like for a woman to come with your mother from Africa to the U.S. and then to have her go through a string of abusive husbands and then land on the last one and get thrown out and, then your mother dies and you end up with your stepfather and he remarries and you've got to, take care of this little sister. I can't imagine what it must have been like for her to go through her whole life and just think God and pull myself up by my bootstraps.
Well, and it's not even, poor people that are affected by this. Obviously, poor and minority folks don't have the resources to be able to effectively handle the situations in certain circumstances. But, I had a girlfriend whose family was very wealthy, and she clearly had mental health issues, aside from the fact that she was dating me. I mean, obviously that was a problem. But she clearly had mental health issues, and her parents didn't do anything about them until she attempted suicide by slashing her wrists. And even then, they weren't fully open about what was going on.
That's something else. Suicide's not talked about. We had a girl commit suicide, or maybe it was a guy. Someone committed suicide in high school, and my family said that it was a white people thing. Like that was the whole discussion. It's a white people thing. And I was like, well, can we discuss what that means for my white friends then? Like, do I need to worry about them? And they're like, no, it's a white people thing. So then when I try and commit suicide, it's like, it's, oh, you were sad. Well, sad's not the right word, but like, let's continue with that emotion.
Yeah. If you Google "Meet My Supervisor Pete Puma," okay, you will stumble upon a rant that I posted more years ago than I care to think about. Oh God, I find it so hard to believe that this was so long ago. About a supervisor I had who his adopted son, they were having a discussion at one point about suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And his adopted son, said, well, what about the people who jumped off the World Trade Center on 9/11? And my supervisor, lays in hell. Now, I mean, you were, what, 12?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be a dick about your age.
No, I was 12.
But you were, I mean, I was 30-ish on 9/11. And, I mean, my thought was, well, holy shit, how bad must it be for people to jump off that building? And
I mean, it's either that or burn to death.
Right. Or get crushed when the thing collapses or whatever. And this guy's attitude was, well, they jumped, so they committed suicide, so they're in fucking hell now. And it's like, I don't care. Let's say I'm absolutely wrong in all this and there actually is a fucking God. Anybody who would choose to condemn somebody to internal pain and suffering because that person jumped off a building rather than burn to death, and I have experienced all the pain of third-degree burns, so I know exactly what it's like. is not somebody I want anything to do with.
Right.
And, so, the thing with that girlfriend of mine, it was like, I knew she had mental health problems, and part of the reason I was in a relationship with her was just because it's like, I'm the only thing that can keep her alive. Because her parents, they don't see her anorexia as a serious issue. They don't recognize that the fact that somebody who is basically at their perfect BMI weight, deciding to starve themselves, has issues. It was just all kinds of craziness. But even after she slashed her wrists, they weren't fully recognizing that she had mental health problems and dealing with it, and they were phenomenally wealthy.
I can't even continue to dissect that because, of course...
No, you can say whatever you want. You can say it.
I can't understand being this person that birthed this child and swore to love them for forever and has the resources and sees them in pain, or maybe chooses not to see them in pain and doesn't fucking help them.
Right. And that's what it was. They chose not to see her in pain. They chose not to recognize her issues. I mean, honestly, because if her parents would have been decent human beings, she wouldn't have dated me. It was ultimately the reason she dated me was because her parents hated me. So, I was a way to get back at them. And I knew this, but I was like, she's hot. I'll never be able to date anything this hot again. So I'm taking it while I can. And that, maybe that makes me a bad person, but, and I wasn't exactly the best boyfriend in the world to her, but I did try to help her. I did, talk to her. I did say, your feelings, your emotions are valid. And, if you're suicidal, it's not because you're stupid. It's because there are things in your situation which are wrong.
I always hope bad things happen to those people, and I know that's not okay.
Well, bad things happening to her parents wouldn't necessarily be wrong. They had they acted differently, they could have defused a lot of things, and they didn't. And I mean, for all my innumerable faults, I actually did try to do the right things by that girlfriend because I wanted to make an impression on her parents. And that's that relationship, as well as others that I've had, is what made me a feminist because, I'm here trying to be the good guy, trying to do what's right, trying to, have a positive impression on her parents or, this other girlfriend's parents or whatever. But I'm automatically seen as the bad guy because, her virginity is seen as a commodity. And, let's be honest. Having sex with virgins really isn't a very good time.
No, it's not. I don't understand why people are like, let's fuck virgins.
I mean, to be brutally honest, screwing somebody who's married is better than screwing a virgin, because somebody who's married is hugely eager, and at least they know something about what they're doing in the sack. Whereas a virgin, it's just all like, okay, you or both of us are fumbling around trying to figure this shit out.
Right. Yeah, I'm not a fan of virgin sex. I don't understand why my ex, he was able to sort of like condition me because he was my first, and then I was conditioned to how he liked to have sex. Although he was also really good about like, all right, do you like this? What does that feel like? But I can't imagine why that man wanted to have sex with me, because I'm sure it sucked for the first like several months.
I get that. I'm not gonna hazard a guess off the top of my head, but I've had sex with a couple of virgins, and in the beginning, it was more painful for me than it was pleasurable. Just because nobody been in there, stretching things out or whatever. And honestly, there's something really erotic about a woman who says, this is how I need it to get off.
Right.
I mean, I had one girlfriend who, she's like, I get off okay this way, but really, if you want me to get off, you gotta take me from behind. And I was like, all right, baby. I'm more than happy to do that. So, and I just don't know. I just don't know. It's all this weirdness that's wrapped up with sexuality and religion, etc., etc.
Yeah. We would all be happier sexual beings if we could let that shit go. And it amazes me when atheists are still... They still have the hang-ups, and they won't admit they still have the hang-up. That is always very interesting to me. Yeah. I very briefly dated a guy who was not okay with the fact that I was also attracted to women. He thought that was disgusting. And I was very shocked.
I mean, most guys I know would be like, wait, you like chicks too? Score! Because what does every guy want? 2 chicks at the same time.
Right, which shocked me, because that was my first instance with a guy that was like, yeah, no, 2 chicks having sex together is gross.
And I mean, honestly, if I was in, I would prefer to be in a relationship with a woman who was bisexual, even if we were totally monogamous with one another, simply because of the fact that, I know that when I look at a woman whom is physically attractive, part of my head goes, oh, I'd like to hit that. And if I can share that with someone, even if neither of us want to, actually have sex with this woman, but we find her attractive, it's a lot easier to say, hey, look at that hot thing over there, than it is to, okay, I'm going to pretend I didn't notice that this girl walked past me with, pasties on and a giant rack.
Oh, God. There is, my mind just went to giant rack. There is a woman in Sweden. I'll have to send you the photo. And she has breasts now easily the size of basketballs, if not larger. Like, this woman's breasts are so big. Actually, we may be talking like watermelons, right? Like, this is fucking ridiculous.
Right.
And she does it because she thinks she's beautiful. And then also, she has a tan so dark, Ishmael seems white in comparison.
Having seen pictures of Ishmael, that is really dark. I mean, that's darker than you.
Significantly darker than me. She's like Nigerian blue-black, right? She's getting there. And I just, when you said that, I thought of this woman, and I'm so sorry.
No, well, I prefer, natural breasts of any size over fake boobies. Not that I've been with a woman who's had fake boobies, but, I'd rather be there with what's there than something they've had added. And I'm a big, huge fan, for some reason, of large areolas. And I'll just say this, the weirdest thing is every woman I've been with who's been large-breasted, it's always been a wham-bam, thank you, ma'am situation, and I've not been able to spend a lot of time playing with them and being in a relationship. I don't know why, but that's how it's just worked out.
I'm very much a butt person on both my men and my women. I like larger back ends.
Well, I'm a disappointment for you then. I have no ass.
Damn it, Tucker.
I wish I did, because it's uncomfortable sitting when you've got no ass.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fosnuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.